And welcome back to all of you out there in magick.tv land. This is Rob, and yeah, I know it's been a while, but unfortunately, my hetero life partner Wade will not be with me tonight because he's working hard for himself and his family. But who better than to restart magick.tv after its unfortunate hiatus than what I'd like to call a synthesis of both body, mind, and spirit. This individual wrote two books which kept me up at night that he had the honor of sending to me here in the Philippines. The first was Being and Non-Being an Occult Experience, where he tapped about the Book of the Law of Aleister Crowley. He actually made me remove the dust off of my copy and look at it again because of how profoundly he wrote into that topic. The second book that he wrote recently that just came out was none other than A Druid in Psychologist Clothings, which just made me ask myself one fundamental question. Rob, why didn't you continue your study of psychology? But then again, because of that, I'm a show host now, and who better than to have to discuss all of these amazing things than our guest of honor tonight, the ever so intellectual Dr. Ian C. Edwards. Hello, Dr. Edwards.
How you doing? It's a pleasure for me to be here, truly. It's an honor. And so I'm looking forward to us having a conversation.
Well, Doc, I'm looking forward to talking to you. So let's start off. How did it begin for Dr. Edwards? How did you get from psychologist to occultist, druidry to ANATHEMA? Just tell us your story, please.
Yeah, it's actually a long story that probably goes back at least to like 1997, 1998. So at that time, I had always been a voracious sort of eclectic reader, even during my undergraduate days in South Florida in the United States. My undergraduate degree is actually in psychology with a minor in anthropology, but I always felt the need to supplement my reading, and so I had this voracious appetite. So I was reading philosophy, I was reading psychology, I was reading different forms of spirituality, engaging in different contemplative practices. And when I was thinking about graduate school, I wanted a program that would weave all of those different interests together. And so, I started doing extensive research, and there were very few, if any, that integrated all of my interests, but there was one in particular, Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States, that had a psychology program, in particular clinical psychology program, that was predicated on a depth psychological approach and also weaving in different existential phenomenological interests as well. And so I ended up applying to that program and fortunately getting into that program because I wanted something that would allow me to practice as a clinical psychologist, be fully accredited, but also nurture my interests. So when I got into that program and I went through the round of coursework whereby I was schooled in various existential phenomenological psychologists and philosophers, depth psychologists within psychoanalysis, post-structuralism, various philosophers as well. I started to develop an interest in the more esoteric, if you will, occult side of Carl Jung's works. And so I started reading some of his earlier works a little more closely, in particular his dissertation on the occult, and then I moved my way more into some of his alchemical studies. And so as I was exploring those particular texts, it broadened my interests. And so I started opening the door to just looking at occult authors and occult writers in general. Aleister Crowley, Israel Regardie. Israel Regardie, for me, is someone that in many ways I'll try to pattern myself after in some way without imitation, simply because he was a magician and he was also a neo-Reichian psychoanalyst. Many people may or may not know that, but he practiced a form of therapy in the tradition of Wilhelm Reich, who was also very much an influence on me. So I started to look into various occult authors, Crowley, Rigardi, Andrew Chumley, also looking into some of the more ancient kind of alchemical texts, and really developed an interest in these ideas because, like Jung and James Hillman, who was one of Jung's disciples, if you will, I was very interested in the way psyche expressed itself in different forms. And so through occult practice, through various esoteric traditions, I was fascinated with the way in which the psyche presented itself and the way it revealed itself. And so as a developing psychotherapist at the time, and now a more seasoned psychotherapist, I wanted to be very mindful and very much aware of how both the personal and the collective unconscious expressed itself in the lives of my patients. And still to this day, and while I write more intellectually heavy types of texts, I see myself first and foremost as a healer, as a depth psychotherapist. And so when I read esoteric texts or even engage in various contemplative or occult practices, it's for the purpose of healing and also being able to offer aspects of my own healing journey to that of my patients. So I try to expose myself to as much literature as possible, to engage in as many different practices as possible, primarily from the perspective of someone who's seeking to heal the soul. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Doctor, if you don't mind me asking, what role does transpersonal psychology play in your practice and your study right now, if any?
It plays a huge role, actually. I've been very much influenced by the works of Ken Wilber, for instance, who's one of the pioneers, if you will, along with like Stanislav Grof, of this transpersonal psychological movement. And the way I really appropriate transpersonal psychology is through a developmental model, for instance. So when you look at transpersonal models of psychology or transpersonal models of the psyche, in particular Wilber's model, one of the nice things that they do is they take into account stages of development and states of consciousness that transcend the rational. So if you look at the developmental models of most contemporary psychologists and also those that were pioneers in their field, such as Piaget, Freud, Kohlberg, Gilligan, folks of that nature, their models do not take into account these transrational, transpersonal states and stages of development, where models like Wilber certainly does, right? And so if you look at like Freud's psychosexual model of development, for instance, any type of transpersonal state is considered a pre-personal state. So oftentimes what Wilber would say that happens is that people that rigidly adhere to a more psychoanalytic interpretation of development make the pre-trans fallacy, where they confuse or conflate the pre-personal with the transpersonal with the pre-personal. And so Freud was one to look at, for instance, a lot of these transpersonal states and transpersonal stages of development as regressions in some way, as pre-personal states or regressions back to earlier stages of psychosexual development.
Now, in your book, Being a Non-Being, an Occult Experience, you started it with the Book of the Law. Now, you could have started this, I think, with anything. You could have started this with the Key of Solomon. You could have started with the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, Craig Williams is going to kill me for that. But what made you want to start first with the Book of the Law from, of course, Aleister Crowley himself? And since you've done already a series of these, why was this the one you started with? I'm just really curious about that.
Aleister Crowley and Thelema had always been a huge impact on me, philosophically, spiritually, and psychologically. And one of the things that actually intrigued me about it was sort of the forbidden nature of making a comment on it, right? And so there's this idea that one shall not comment on the Book of the Law, even though many different types of comments and commentaries have been written. So this transgressive act of someone in many ways coming from outside of established occult circles, someone who was very little known in esoteric groups, would come and bring a psychological and philosophical and contemplative kind of direction to the Book of the Law and expand it in ways that maybe it had never been expanded before. And so one of the things that appealed to me about that was just the fact that I always thought, as much as had been written on the Book of the Law, there was still a lot of juice left in it. There were still so many different ways that one could reflect and comment on that. And the method that I really use, not only in Volume 1, but in all of the Being and Non-Being volumes, is a method that I call like a participatory epistemological approach, where I participate in the text itself so that I feel into the words, I feel into the sentences, and I allow them to evoke and invoke different types of experiences and even presences within me, which allows me in many ways to transcend and transgress my own egoic way of thinking and write from a place of creativity, write from a place of spontaneity, and to really participate in the text as if I'm dialoguing with it.
Now, for my next question, Doctor, as a clinical psychologist, usually those are the individuals you usually find that are a bit more open-minded to the practices that we're doing, the studies we're doing. But have you had any blowback from the psychological community saying that, oh, you're just having some sort of idiosyncratic experience, or you're just having delusions of grandeur? And how has that helped you, or how have you worked around that as a practicing magician?
Oh, for sure. And I certainly have to be careful in terms of the audience that I present this information to, because within mainstream psychological circles, this kind of work that I'm engaging in would be anathema. It would be forbidden in many ways, and I could be ostracized, and have been, within certain psychological circles, just for this interest that I have, and also the fact that I'm writing about these texts. Kind of puts me in a position where I get marginalized by my own psychological communities in many ways. But I keep in mind, too, that this was sort of a trajectory that Jung himself had followed, right? And although we didn't get access to the Red Book and to the Black Books until years later after his death, there were certainly those esoteric and occult leanings in his ideations and in his reflections early on. And in addition to his own sort of different take on the libido theory in terms of how he and Freud dialogued about that, it was also his interest in occultism and esoteric thought that kind of misaligned him with Freud and got him ostracized, to the point where many of Freud's followers at the time thought Jung was psychotic. They actually used the term psychotic. Now, it's different the way the analysts used that term at that point in time than in the way the medical community might use that now. And so you would have to look at different kinds of personality structures to be able to really examine what that is. But nevertheless, I feel very much an affinity with him in many ways, but in particular, the fact that my own community at times would ostracize me for that. And so the circles that I tend to run in, as far as psychology is concerned, are those depth psychologists that have that sympathy toward that work. One of my mentors and clinical supervisors, Stan Marlin, author of a book called The Black Sun, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. I remember when I first went into his office for supervision when I was a graduate student, I looked and he had a picture of Aleister Crowley in his office. And this was a time when I was struggling, with my own calling within the field, because I had wanted to originally write a psychobiography on Aleister Crowley for my dissertation, and had got a lot of the preliminary work done with that before it was actually rejected by the university. And I was even told, and I'm not going to name who this person is at the university, that if I was interested in these type of topics, that I should leave the field of psychology and go become a mystic. And so I was actually told that, and then I remember telling Dr. Marlin about this, and he was angry about that, you know, not in a way that was overt, but I could tell that he felt, and during our subsequent conversations, and based on his own writings and reflections, that occultism is not only an area that psychologists do explore, but it's one that they should explore. And so I felt an affinity with him and his approach to psychotherapy and psychology. So there was alignment there and support for what I was doing. But the unwritten dissertation on Aleister, the psychobiography of Aleister Crowley, eventually became the draft for a druid and psychologist clothing. And the published version of that we have now in our hands is a greatly expanded and revised version of that dissertation.
I was just grabbing it. The next question I have for you is this is actually something that I would want to pick your brain on. Now, if you are a magician that has practiced the art of evocation, and I don't know if you have or haven't, but due to your experiences, if you have, would you consider yourself a follower of the psychological model of that they're all in our head, or just aspects of the human psyche? Or are you of the belief that they are external entities and we need to show them due reverence? I really would like to get your take on this.
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I would say, like, early on in my career and early on in my development, I would have preferred the former explanation, that these are somehow archetypal forces that flow in and through the psyche. And I still believe in some ways that they have that powerful component to it. But I think the way in which psychological language is constructed, even the language of a Jungian variety, permits for aspects of that experience to escape the language that we would use to describe it. So when I go to describe experiences in response to evocation and invocation and the presence of certain entities or spirits, the language that I would use psychologically cannot fully capture that. And that's part of the reason why I did not look at the Book of the Law from a primarily psychological perspective, because I felt that there had to be a language that could be used to describe these experiences and the experience that I was having that at least came closer to an encounter with the phenomenon itself. And so if we go to the other explanation, you know, and we're of course forming a dichotomy between the psychological and the metaphysical, and in some ways the truth is in between but also transcends that as well. And so are these actual entities, are they actual spirits that come into being and can be seen with one's physical senses? Absolutely, I believe that's the case. But they also have significant psychological import as well. And I think sometimes it's important, and I think Israel Regardie was the one who really emphasized this, that those that would engage in the magical arts or engage in occult practices should be involved in some form of psychotherapy in some way. That in some ways that it was a fundamental or an essential prerequisite, because I think there are cases where one can certainly believe or even hallucinate to a certain extent a particular presence and feel very strongly that they're experiencing that, when in fact it's a split off aspect of the psyche that is manifesting in a very powerful way that invites first and foremost psychological work, maybe prior to or alongside of the spiritual work that one would engage in.
Oh, that's a very amazing answer, and I'm just blown away by what you said with that. Now, what I wanted to ask of you next is this, and we were talking about this earlier, and I've observed that a lot of people in the occult community can usually go one of two directions. They either get really fat or they're really scrawny, and you're just the epitome of Super Saiyan, where you're like an occultist, but you're in great shape. What is the significance of this, and why is it important? Because I'd like to incorporate this into my own routine if possible.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a great question. You know, since I started practicing, I would say, any form of contemplative work or spiritual work, which goes back, to the late 20th century, and maybe even prior to that, I had integrated a physical practice alongside that. And so I was a wrestler in high school. I was always into weight training, strength training, intense HIIT kind of training. And what I've noticed, and I think a lot of the research really lends support to this, especially now, is that any kind of physical practice that develops, if you will, the physical body, and I'm using these terms, physical body, spiritual body, mental body, not to say that I believe that they're separate, just only because I'm using these terms to designate a series of practices within each area. And so I think when you, for instance, practice both meditation, let's just take meditation for example, and let's say you're a practitioner of Zazen, you want to, and this is something that you do on a regular basis. When I have practiced Zazen consistently, and I still do to this very day, it's a practice that I engage in routinely, and also engage in a pretty intense physical training kind of regimen that involves weight training, that involves cardio, what I notice is that there's cross-fertilization in each of the areas. And so when we talk about various magical practices in terms of strengthening and developing the will, right, I notice that when I'm engaging in strength training, and let's say I'm doing something called German volume training, where it's 10 sets of 10 in the squat rack with 60-second breaks in between. Now, at some point in time, your body begins to kind of give out a little bit. And so you reach a kind of limit experience where you feel like you can't go anymore. But the various contemplative practices that I've engaged in that have strengthened my will, that have strengthened my desire, those particular practices have augmented my physical training, helping me to persevere maybe through 3 sets that I felt like I couldn't do otherwise. Now, also, like if I'm engaged in a contemplative practice that involves intense concentration and stillness for a long period of time, intense physical training actually augments and strengthens that to allow one's posture to be more firm, to allow one's will to be in alignment with one's body. And so you begin to see the cross-fertilization of each practice onto the other as opposed to separating them out.
Because I asked this question because I suffer from this problem that I have the either or curse. Because like I could do a day's worth of magical work, but I find out that I'm really smoked afterwards, that there's like nothing left in the battery. Or vice versa, I could train jujitsu and lift weights, but when I get home, I don't even have that focus anymore to get into the books, to do the ritual, because I'm too spent. What's your secret to be able to do both effectively and not lose quality from one or the other? Is there any secret method you have?
Well, yeah, I think for me, like I emphasize, because of my own schedule, quality over quantity. And there are, obviously for my weight training routine, that's a specific practice that I might begin at like 5:30 in the morning. Now, I'll get up at 4:30 though. And so that means that there's an hour prior to that. And so oftentimes with that hour will be spent in contemplative and spiritual practice, leading up to my weight training routine. Now, throughout the day, oftentimes, so let's say subsequent to both the contemplative practice and the weight training, I try to be in a particular mindset that is meditative, that is contemplative, right, that is magical in some way. I'm reminded of the passage in St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, I believe, where he says, pray without ceasing, right? And so if you think about, well, how does one pray without ceasing, right? You can't constantly be verbalizing different prayers, but it's a way of being. It's a state of mind. It's a way of engaging or being in the world that is prayerful, that is contemplative, that is magical, that, there's a way in which one interprets or experiences any phenomenon that one encounters in the world as God's personal dealing with one's soul. And you hear that very thing, mentioned in the works of Aleister Crowley. I'm going to take up the world in such a way that everything that happens to me is a way of the divine dealing specifically with my own psyche, with my own soul, right? And so there's a practice that I will engage in that's actually based on a lot of Kenneth Grant's work, this idea of the mauve zone, right? Which is if you read his work carefully, it's a perspective, it's a vantage point. Well, the way I take it up in volume 3 of Being and Non-Being an Occult Experience, it's a 4-dimensional perspective that one takes and uses that to interpret or make sense of the 3-dimensional world. So it's kind of like bringing a dream state or beyond and dreaming while awake and bringing that to the actual world. So in a way, in psychoanalysis, one interprets dreams in terms of waking consciousness. But with this approach, which kind of gets inverted, you kind of look at the world symbolically, metaphorically, as if it were a dream, and that every aspect of the world is also an aspect of oneself, kind of like the idea of thou art that, and one kind of has that at the forefront of their mind.
Whoa, that just really puts a lot of thoughts in my head. I'm already going to schedule you for a second interview after this, because it's like, wow. Because the next thing I want to ask you is, from a psychological viewpoint, okay, there have been some occultists like Dion Fortune who said that most practitioners of magic will go one of two directions. They will go either direction of the mystic, where they renounce the world, or they will go the direction of the occultist, where they seek to use the powers of the occult to just make themselves living gods in their own perspective. Now, based on everything you've shared, you're basically making it sound like there could be a synthesis between the two. And this can be the same, like between the difference between occultism and magic and religion. So from your perspective as a clinical psychologist, how do you reconcile these two?
Well, sure. So first and foremost, I think I would have to begin just by briefly describing my own philosophical anthropology, or kind of view of the human person. And I think this is the case with many mystics and contemplatives, but also depth psychologists within the tradition of Jung, in that we are of two worlds, right? And so we are of the terrestrial world and also the non-terrestrial, or sort of, to use Kenneth Grant's terminology, extraterrestrial. There's this idea that we're both spirit, but we're also body, right? And so we're flesh and we're also soul in many ways. So I'm very mindful of the fact that as a being in the world, I inhabit two worlds, flesh and spirit. And I think the idea is to integrate them together, but not always to see the spiritual world, if you will, or the esoteric world as being separate from the terrestrial, but present within the very terrestrial world itself. And so, John Keats said that the world is basically a veil for soul making, right? And so if you look at the world, soul is being revealed all the time, spirit is being revealed all the time. There's this idea of an anima mundi, or a world soul, that I very much subscribe to. So if I'm connected to that in some way as a being in the world, and one quote that really helped me to grasp this idea of synthesis was a quote by Alan Watts. He said, "The flesh does not separate me from the world, but connects me to it." And so it's not this Cartesian dualistic perspective where I'm encased, my soul or spirit is encased in the flesh. We're embodied, incarnated beings that are constantly in contact with the world, but the world that is ensouled. And so to find soul and spirit, it is through the world itself. The world reveals soul in every way, shape, or form. And Jung was one who very much subscribed to a very Taoist model of the cosmos, where psyche and world were trying to promote one another's co-evolution and co-development. So if I'm attuned to the world as an embodied being, nature, the world, the other, is constantly working toward my own development, and vice versa. So I would coexist and work in harmony with nature when in some way I align myself to the will of the cosmos. One of the images that I have is a giant. So if you think of a giant, the giant has their feet on the ground but their head in the clouds. And so that's an image that I often use as a kind of aspiration in some way, is that I don't want to be either or, I want to be both. I want to be a person of the world and enjoy the pleasures and the joys of the world, the joys of the flesh, and even see the expression of soul and spirit through that, but also in many ways be able to take time aside and separate myself from the world and engage in various contemplative and meditative practices.
Wow, as in I'm like I said, I'm blown away by learning this about you, from you. It's just like it gives a new perspective to this really important thing to me that I've been contemplating on for the past couple of months. Which brings me to my next question. The Being and Non-Being series has been nothing but spectacular. It started with the Book of the Law, then you had Osman Spare, and now you have Ken Grant. Will it end with a volume 3, or do you have other authors that you're planning on doing similar works to? And I'd love to hear what you have plans for this series.
So yeah, it's a volume 4 is going to be the culminating volume of that series.
Mm-hmm.
So we have Crowley, we have Spare, we have Grant, and I think volume 4 is going to deal with the work of Andrew Chumley.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of different ideas that I want to explore as far as that's concerned, but I haven't been able to really narrow them down as of yet. One of the things that I've been kind of looking at, and this might be even a separate work in its entirety, is the presence of what would be considered the archetypal witch at each stage of the life cycle. So it's kind of looking at this notion of the archetypal witch within the context of Erik Erikson's 8-stage life cycle, to see the presence of this archetypal force in how it kind of assists in the working through of various crises, to use Erikson's term. And so that's one of the musings that I've had. But also, like, if it's going to be congruent with the other 3 volumes of the series, I'm looking at it ontologically too, at the questions of being, becoming, and non-being. And so I found a way to connect the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, French phenomenologist in the 20th century, specifically in his later work called The Visible Invisible, where in a brief note he talks about this idea of being as winding, right? This winding idea of being. And I thought that was interesting to compare that, like, with the ontology of Heidegger, for instance, in the way he puts forward being. But then to look at this idea of being as winding in, the Sabbatic witchcraft kind of literature, which in many ways, at least for me, introduces a very powerful philosophical anthropology, a view of the person, but also has its own unique ontology. And with that said, like, an even bigger project of mine would be able to construct a psychology and a psychotherapy based on these principles, like a whole new psychology, a whole new psychotherapy with a different philosophical anthropology, and then to see what a therapy of the soul would look like when you come at it from different origins, simply because as esoteric and occult as Jung was, he was very much stuck within a monotheistic tradition. And you can say most of psychoanalysis, if it's anything, is a extension of a monotheistic type of religion, just because it's a monotheism of the psyche, it's a monotheism of the soul. It's really only in the work of James Hillman where you start to get into this notion of a polytheistic psychology and a psychotherapy that's not predicated on Judeo-Christian foundations. So I have a similar interest with the Sabbatic witchcraft literature that Hillman did with Greek polytheism, just looking at what psychotherapy and healing would look like based on different foundations.
Well, my better half Wade is asking, are you familiar with Kant's antinomies? I don't know what that is.
A certain degree. I was never really an avid reader of Kant, and so I'm familiar with it to a certain degree, but not to be able to talk about it in any intelligent or I think exhaustive sort of way. But it's something I'll definitely look into.
Well, my next question for you, Doctor, is this: there seems to be a rise in kind of like a new popularity of theurgy. More and more people are getting interested in older gods like the Egyptian gods or Hecate or Anubis, and more people are getting into this now. From a psychological point of view, especially with these people who are trying to communicate with these older gods, can we say, like in the words of Lon Milo Duquette, it's all in your head, you just don't know how big your head is? Or are they actually communing with something there, and are they being contacted by something beyond their presence?
Yeah, it's similar to I think the question that you asked before about what happens phenomenologically in response to invocation and evocation, whether or not these presences or entities are real. So I think in some ways it's kind of a comparable sort of question. I think in some ways there's a real psychological need for certain people to move towards different deific or God forms that best in some way can help them along in their individuation process. So I'm speaking about it primarily from a Jungian point of view. And so if you have an aspirant, for instance, someone who's a practitioner in the occult, and for instance, they're also very much mindful of their own path of individuation, there are certain God forms that are going to integrate with their psyche more so or better than others. And so, Hecate, for instance, is a deific form that really appeals to me. And so I talk a lot about her in Volume 2 of Being and Non-Being an Occult Experience. And so I look at her as like an ontological kind of structure, but also a particular path that allows us to experience this intersection between being, non-being, and becoming a little bit differently. And so I think one can go back and appropriate relationships with these deities, but what I've always been mindful is how oftentimes with some people they take up these deific forms in a very Judeo-Christian sort of way. And so there's a way in which maybe the form or the name of the deity might change, but the way in which one relates to it is in a very Judeo-Christian way. And so I've always been curious about what it would look like to have an encounter with these deific forms, whether they're real or whether they're psychological, in a way that kind of transgresses this Judeo-Christian monotheistic approach, where there's almost like a kind of fundamentalism that tends to be there. You see some folks within the occult world, they'll take up occult subjects in a very fundamentalist sort of way. And that, for me, speaks to an underlying Judeo-Christian influence, where one looks at things very dogmatically. But that, for me, speaks more to where that person is on their own path of individuation. So there's a way in which a relationship with a deific form can really help one advance in their own individuation path, especially if it could help them dissolve old psychological structures that created a lot of suffering and then free them from that.
So my better half Wade has another question. The series books on being and non-being, would you recommend these people for preparing to cross the abyss?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think in many ways, and I think the operative word is preparing, right? And so I'd really focus a lot on the word to prepare for that, rather than to actually do that in and of itself. Because I know in a lot of different places in Volume 1 and also in Volume 2, and it makes its presence known in Volume 3, there's discussion of the abyss, there's a discussion of the void. And I think, yeah, for those that are preparing to do that, these books can definitely assist with that. But also I think, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, one's own psychotherapeutic journey. I think that is vitally important when one prepares to cross the abyss, that one is engaging in this deep psychospiritual work, just because of the dangers of what can happen in that particular space in terms of the ego structure being dissolved. And so I always like to think of like something like crossing the abyss, and to reflect on how that would intersect with a person's characterological or personality structure, right? And how that factors into a person's attachment style, interestingly enough. So I would want to bring my own understanding of personality development and attachment theory to the practice of crossing the abyss as a preparation. So the books in and of themselves, for me, could not assist someone in that part of their journey, but it's certainly an adjunct to other practices, and certainly something to keep in mind, especially when you look at, again, personality structure and attachment theory.
Sorry about that. All right, so you don't need to answer this if you don't want to, but if you are the kind of clinical psychologist that also caters to fellow occultists, in other words, like I am an occultist, and due to my experiences, my practices, I come to you for clinical support, how common are breakdowns, psychological breakdowns? How have you observed in the occult community? It's like, are you getting more clients like me who've gotten goofed up because of like a dark night of the soul? And is it something you can come back from?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I've had a number of people reach out to me from the occult world that are interested in either psychotherapy or some form of spiritual direction. And for me, that's an honor, because one of the narratives that I hear is that they have been in psychotherapy before, but their psychotherapist wasn't receptive to their worldview and kind of wanted to interpret that worldview away, especially if one is going maybe to a traditional whole screen went white there.
You still there? Still there?
Yeah, the whole screen went white temporarily. Maybe that was a synchronicity.
Okay. Continue.
Yeah, I think it was on my end where the whole screen just went entirely white. I apologize for that. But a lot of folks have come to me from the occult world who didn't feel like their worldview was respected by their therapist, or wanted to see it more from a pathological point of view. And so I've been honored to receive folks in my practice, but also just folks that I would take up from the perspective of spiritual direction. So yeah, I think for those that are on this particular path, and you mentioned the dark night of the soul, or kind of being alchemically in this nigredo phase of one's development, where everything seems to be dissolving and disintegrating, that's a necessary part of the individuation process, just as it is the alchemical process. And what people need is a safe container, or a safe space, or even a chamber, if you will. And I consider my consulting room very much like an alchemical chamber, a very sacred space where someone, if they needed to, could come in and dissolve in a safe place. But as Mark Epstein likes to say, to go to pieces without falling apart, right? And so there's an important distinction there. So the idea with many of the people that are on a particular spiritual path, namely one of the esoteric ones, is they might be in a phase where they're in the process of dissolving or disintegrating, and their life and their world seems to be unraveling. And the idea is to see what's emerging from that, what kind of wholeness, what aspect of their individuation is emerging from that disintegrating structure, and to hopefully keep them together as they go through this process, which can be excruciatingly painful. And for me, one doesn't want to romanticize or overly romanticize this dark night of the soul experience, because it's an intense blackness, it's an intense depression. Stan Marlin in his work, The Black Sun, and in my own work, I like to talk about this idea of the luminous darkness, right? That the darkness has its own light, and it doesn't necessarily have to be transformed into light, but to see the light itself that emerges from the darkness. And that can be very difficult for someone who's in intense psychological or emotional pain.
In cases like those, doctor, are you of the subscription that a person might need to go on what Frater Acher calls a magical Lent, like a slow down for a bit, let's heal first? Or are you of the school of thinking like, no, you are already like halfway through hell, let's go out the other end?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it depends on, and I'll come back to this, like it often depends on the personality structure and organization of that person, their attachment style, their own lived experience, their own psychosocial and psychosexual history, in terms of whether that would be one versus the other. But oftentimes, for some people, they have to slow down and they have to pause. And before they proceed any further along a spiritual path, they have to heal the parts of the soul or parts of the psyche that require healing. And that can involve doing some really intense, depth-oriented work, where they might have to look at aspects of their childhood experience, their adolescent experience, any instances or history of trauma that might preoccupy them or might be drawing their attention. And kind of like the idea in Vajrayana Buddhism and Tantra, but for me in depth psychology, the way out is the way through. And so you feel your way through an experience. And that's the same for me in a lot of my own spiritual practices. This idea that the way out is the way through, that you feel your way through things, and whatever emotion might be there, whatever feeling might be there, you allow yourself to feel those emotions and to experience those emotions intensely even. Because one's defenses oftentimes in relation to trauma, it's not so much that it's the repressed memory that's the most problematic, but it's the emotion. I think that psychological journey, and sometimes it does require a pause, that one has to take a little bit of a break from their spiritual practice to be able to pay attention to what needs to be healed.
That's amazing. So, wow, thank you for that one wonderful lesson. I mean, I learned so much from you. So before we get to the last part of the show, this is not a Jon Stewart segment of the show where I ask you, Dr. Ian Edwards, what's your take right now on the practices of magic, occultism? Is it growing? Is it getting worse? Are we hitting a new renaissance? And what are your hopes for it for the next few years?
Yeah, so I would say I'm very optimistic, right? And so, but I'm also a dialectician, kind of in the tradition of Hegel. And so I see sort of the play of the dialectic, this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, like within the field of occultism itself. And so you certainly have elements of that that are a bit more traditional, if you will, and there's nothing wrong with tradition. I absolutely love it. And then you see the more progressive sides of things, where there's almost like at times a conflict between the two schools and the two camps and the two ways of thinking. But I think for me what is ultimately most important is the creativity that emerges from the conflict itself. And it's really an imagined conflict. It's not really a real conflict as much as it is imagined. So I see, for me, and that's one of the reasons why I got involved with Atramentis Press, because of Peter's own interest in dialoguing existential phenomenology with occultism. And so for me, I saw that as a kind of renaissance or a rebirth, and a way to bring different schools of thought to occult philosophy and occult practices that hadn't really been brought there before. So this idea that he writes about, like the existential witch, for instance, and kind of using folks like Husserl and Levinas as a way to make sense of occult experience, for me signified a renaissance. And there are others that are doing similar things, but also doing really creative things in unique ways. But where I think for me I can make the most impact is to bring some of my own intellectual and academic influences to occultism, to see what would happen when you dialogue Heidegger, Nietzsche, Georges Bataille, Jacques Lacan with Austin Spare or Aleister Crowley or Andrew Chumley. These are strange bedfellows, right, in many ways, and some people don't like this. Some people think this is very academic, this is too intellectual, and there's no place for this, and that's fine. But I think it signifies a new way of taking up occult experience by using a different kind of language to express it. Like Jacques Lacan and his psychoanalytic approach. Some of the things that I found in his work, in particular his seminars in relation to feminine jouissance, for instance, very much in many ways connects with what Austin Spare is talking about in many of his works. And so I'm bringing these two folks together, and I'm thinking, my gosh, like, without knowing it, in some ways these people are saying the same kind of thing, but in a different sort of way. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's definitely a renaissance or a rebirth that's happening. And for me, as a writer within these traditions, it's exciting to be part of.
All right, so that says a lot, and that's very optimistic. I'm hoping that that's going to be the reality. I mean, on the other end, we see a lot of wannabes out there who, like, there's that old saying. Somebody just taught it to me yesterday. Dunning-Kruger effect, where the people who know the least are the ones who are making the most amount of noise. We need more people like you, Dr. Edwards, making more noise so people get the real truth and the real idea out there. So for the last part of the show is what we call Occultex. This is where we let all of our guests teach us something, anything you'd like. Sky's the limit. Could be as complex or as easy as you want. We'd love to learn something from you today, Dr. Edwards.
All right, that sounds good. So what I'm going to actually do for this particular section, I'm going to introduce a practice, if you will, to have this be more pragmatically based. And this is a practice in the appendix section from Being and Non-Being an Occult Experience, Volume 2. And it's something that I will do on occasion. I'm a big proponent of mantra, forms of meditation, and I have my own particular beads that I use here that are made out of bone, and I'm not going to tell you what type of bone they're made out of, but you can use your imagination in terms of what kind of bone they're made out of. But this is sort of my go-to meditation beads, if you will. And so what I'm going to do, again, I'm going to refer to Volume 2 in the appendix section. And this particular mantra, I've called it, so I'm going to kind of go through it as it is in the book. It's called the In Nomine Mahadiabolos mantra. And for those of you that have read Volume 2 in its entirety and have gotten to the appendix section, are certainly familiar with this and maybe even practiced it. But I'm going to go through it just as a way to introduce you to a practice that really, for me, developed from the writing of Volume 2 itself. And it kind of brings together Austin Spare, it brings together a little bit of Derrida, Lacan, Luciferianism. A lot of different influences have kind of been woven into this. So I'm going to go through it, and for those of you that maybe don't have access to the book, but would want, like, this particular practice sent to them, I'm sure, I can work with you all to be able to figure out how to do that. So let me introduce this to you. The In Nomine Mahadiabolos mantra is what I call a mantra of the opposer or the adversary. It's not intended as a prayer or a meditation on a specific diabolic form, but a mantra that can be repeated to invoke what I would call oppositional or adversarial energies that come from this chiasm or X that I described in Volume 2 of becoming, being, and non-being. And these are like what I would call ecstatic emotions that kind of come from the center of this intersection itself that I referred to as the 0 point. I see these energies primarily as formless, emanating for what I described in Volume 2 as the infinite order. And in Volume 2 I talk about the infinite order and the symbolic order, and I base this discussion actually on the work of Jacques Lacan when he talks about jouissance and feminine jouissance. And the only thing he really says about feminine jouissance is that it comes from the infinite order of things, and it sort of is the realm of the mystics, and he really didn't take that up. So these energies, I argue, come from this infinite order, but they have to be transmuted into words or verbum or logoi to take shape in the symbolic order. What I do in Volume 2 is introduce what I call the sorceress grammatology, kind of looking at grammatology as Derrida talked about it, but through the lens of occultism. And this grammatology is revealed through the signifier, so that nothing can become something as a presentation of the formless. And so the language that I'm using with this mantra emphasizes the word diabolos, adversary, opposer. And this is a signifier that I use that can be a reflection of a specific desire. The name diabolos will almost immediately, for some, evoke associations to the devil. So when I look at it from the perspective of the sigil or sigil making, this is actually good, because with the practice, any such association, you would want to submerge this desire or intent into the unconscious, which is not to invoke the devil as a specific form, but to invoke these adversarial energies. And so when we look at the mantra itself, the idea is to move to what would be called, in some of Spare's terminology, this idea of true belief, where you actually do something that's very different in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, you make the unconscious conscious, and in this idea of sigil making, this idea of true belief that Spare talks about, you're actually repressing the desire into the unconscious and forgetting about it so that the desire can ultimately manifest in some way. And this particular mantra has its basis, that kind of methodology. So what I mentioned before is that the mantra is best repeated on a rosary or a mala or a set of prayer beads. The type that you use is irrelevant. And to begin, what you would do is you would recall something that's opposing you, or something that you want to oppose. This could be a person, this could be an afflictive emotion, this could be a situation. And then what you would do, you would visualize that person, you would visualize that emotion, you would visualize that feeling, almost to the point where you're inhabiting that person, that emotion, that feeling itself. And then once you kind of feel around and you kind of an image of this, you'd be very mindful of what you imaginatively see, hear, taste, touch, smell, as if you have imaginative or subtle body kinds of senses. And once you are immersed or really intimate with this visualization, you would begin, like if you had a prayer bead, a set of prayer beads like this, or a rosary, on the first bead you would say in nomine, and then on the second bead you would say Maha Diabolos. And so with the first part in nomine, you would intone it on the first bead, and you would also breathe in. And then on the second bead, Maha Diabolos, you would breathe out. So it's inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation in nomine, exhalation, Maha Diabolos. And then you would repeat the pattern until you get to the very last bead. And for me, as you can see, there are a lot of beads on this particular mala. And the way I like to look at this, and this isn't unique to me, is that this mala or this rosary signifies the eternal circle. And also, like, I look at it as the Ouroboros, with the first bead being the head and the last bead being the tail. So as you complete the cycle, you would slowly and gently put the rosary down. And then you would simply breathe in and you would breathe out for the next several minutes until you forget about the mantra, or at least try to forget the mantra, and you would allow your mind to kind of enter into a vacuous or empty state. And once your mind is empty for about a minute or so, you can depart with the intent being not to think about your desire. And obviously, the more you try to think about, not to think about your desire, the more your desire obviously comes into awareness. But the idea ultimately with the practice, especially if repeated, is to really repress the desire, to repress the intent into the subconscious, so that, like with the sigil, the desire itself starts to become made manifest. And so ultimately, almost like with the prayer of the heart, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner, one ultimately wants to, at some point, just put down the rosary itself, to put down the mantra itself. So with this particular mantra, it becomes like in sync with one's in-breath and one's out-breath and one's beating of the heart. And so you can repeat this practice as needed. And again, as I said, the breath itself ultimately becomes the mantra. And in looking at, how I talked about this in volume 2, it's a way from knowledge to return to non-knowledge, and to actually kind of symbolically decapitate the Ouroboros so that it becomes headless. Almost like with Peter Hamilton Giles' headless dragon notion. In this case, it's the Ouroboros itself that's becoming headless as one moves from knowledge to non-knowledge.
That's amazing. Wow, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Doctor. I mean, I'm excited to get started on that. And I'll message you privately about the exact words for pronunciation for the mantra, because I don't want people saying it wrong. But from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for teaching me that. It's something I really want to implement.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, before I forget, I'd actually like to take this time for you to promote any upcoming workshops, services, books you have coming on, because I want our viewers to hear about you, where they can find you, how they can hear more about your stuff. Because right now, Wade's even asking when Volume 4 is coming out for the Being and Non-Being series. So promote yourself away.
So yeah, hopefully, the idea with the Being and Non-Being in Occult Experience series was for one to come out every year. And so we had one come out in 2021, one come out in 2022, 2023, and hopefully with 2024 you'll see the emergence or the appearance of Volume 4. So the intention is for Volume 4 to be released in 2024, and that would be the culminating volume of the series. And then I would move on to exploring other topics within the occult world, just because this has only whetted my appetite. And as one can imagine, especially with these Being and Non-Being volumes being slim and almost written as a series of meditations, they've opened up so many other avenues of exploration for me that I would want to extend into even larger books. Right now, Being and Non-Being in Occult Experience Volume 3, Kenneth Grant and the Vulture's Cry, was just released, and it's now available through atramentuspress.com, but soon to be Miskatonic Books and other book vendors around the world. And also the ongoing series that I'm co-writing with Peter Hamilton Giles, The Torn Letters of Otherness. Volume 1 was released about a month ago, and we are just going to continue to produce those volumes with no end in sight, and it's a wonderful dialectic and a dialogue between himself and me. And one of the interesting things that happened that I think with Volume 1, he became, and I don't know if he would agree, but I think he would agree to a certain extent, he became more of the philosopher and the academic, and I became more of the practitioner and the sorcerer in terms of my writing. And so it's like things really inverted in this playful sort of way that for me was very unanticipated. And so like with my own work, I'm more and more kind of moving towards a more overtly sorcerous, if you will, magical kind of approach, and abandoning some of the terminology, the more conventional psychological and philosophical terminology, and just being creative with the language that I use and some of the archetypal forms that I use to describe the lived experiences that I'm having and ways of writing. So the Torn Letters of Otherness through Atramentus Press is great. So be on the lookout for ongoing volumes within that series. But also Anathema Publishing, a Druid and Psychologist clothing, that's still available. Feel free to go to that site and purchase those. And I think all 3 volumes of The Being and Non-Being are still available, with copies of Volume 1 beginning to dwindle to a certain extent. So you might want to get those while you can. And just this mala here, Lhasa Artisan Designs, my very own sister, who's a Tibetan Buddhist, created these for me. A lot of painstaking work, and so Lhasa Artisan Designs. Go to that website and check that out if you want to get a handcrafted mala or rosary created for you that's specific towards your interests.
Amazing, Doctor. So anyhow, we're going to wrap up the show. And please don't go anywhere. I just wanted to thank you after the show. So once again, that's Dr. Ian Edwards. Learned so much from him today. We're definitely going to have you back for season 4 or season 5. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. So thank you for all of you tuned in. See you for the next episode. Good night, everyone.